See? Wait.
That's okay. Yeah,
There we go.
Perfect. See them trying to join the thing.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and start.
Hi, everyone. Can they see me? Okay, let me just. Okay, sounds good. Oh, perfect. Hi. Okay, great. We can go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mansi Shah. I am one of the OB fellows this year in the OB-Gyn department. Thanks to everyone who's tuning in to listen. A little bit about me, I grew up around the corner from this hospital and I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, and then Case Western in Ohio for medical school, and Duke for family medicine residency, and then I came back home for this fellowship. So I initially developed this presentation for our National Family Medicine Resident and Medical Student Conference, and it's with great pleasure that I have adapted it for today. So really quickly, I don't have any financial disclosures to make. And before we get started, we're going to be doing some mental gymnastics this morning, so I wanted us all to take a quick moment to clear our minds, focus on our breathing, and prepare ourselves to be fully present for our time together.
Meal request. We had to put.
Yeah, but it was.
Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to interrogate what race is by exploring the connection between race and biology, starting with the fundamental question of, is there a genetic basis for race? And in this process, I'll be introducing some of the language of critical race theory. We'll use that discussion to reassess our understandings of what health inequities are and how they arise. We'll also review the embodied consequences of experiencing racism, and we'll discuss the implications of assuming race is biological in medical training and practice, and overturn conventional medical knowledge regarding the role of race in clinical medicine. Lastly, we'll also talk about some strategies for improving racial health disparities through research, policy, and clinical care. The majority of the arguments and examples in this presentation are drawn from the work of Dorothy Roberts, who's an eminent race and legal scholar. My disclaimers are that the topics covered in this presentation are really wide-reaching and that much of this presentation takes entire college courses to cover. So there's a lot that I'm leaving out in this lecture, including a discussion on gender and sexuality and disability. Also, I'll mostly be presenting race in terms of a black-white binary, but in fact, as I'm sure everybody can appreciate, race and racism in the US and globally are much more complex. Because this is on Zoom, it's a little bit different from doing it in person. So if you'll have questions, please feel free to type them in the group chat. I will check the group chat every so often, and at the end, we'll definitely get to any questions that we have. So what is race? that's our first question. I'd like to start with a quote from ethnic studies scholars Michael Omi and Howard Winott. They write that there's a continuous temptation to think of race as an essence, as something fixed, concrete, and objective. And there's also an opposite temptation to see it as a mere illusion, which an ideal social order would eliminate. So I want you all to keep that quote in the back of your minds as we go through the next few slides. If we look at the US Census over time, it shows us that race is an unstable political category. For example, the US Census in 1870 and in 2010 defined race very differently. So does that mean that race has changed? In 1790, only free white immigrants could become naturalized citizens. The option to select Mexican was only included in the census starting in 1930, even though Mexicans were granted US citizenship through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. In 2010, we see a lot more options, and it brings up the questions of, are immigrants a separate race or ethnicity? Do Latinx folks have a common ethnicity among multiple races, or are they a separate race? Are Middle Eastern people white too? And what is mixed race? The 1970 census included a question about Hispanic heritage. In 1980, that was changed to Hispanic being ethnicity. And in 2010, the census suggests that Hispanic or Latino is not a race. It suggests that there's only one white race, one Black race, one American Indian, but an unspecified number of Asian races. So you can see how the way that the census has defined race over time has changed quite a bit. There are many state laws that also show this phenomenon of changing over place and time. In 1705, Virginia defined any child, grandchild, or great-grandchild of a Negro as mulatto. In 1886, every person having 1/4 or more Negro blood was deemed a colored person. And in 1910, that percentage was changed to 1/16. In 1924, Virginia passes a rule called the Racial Purity Act, which defined Black persons as having any trace of African ancestry. This is commonly known as the one-drop rule, that if you have any ancestor who's Black or any one drop of Black blood, then you're also Black, regardless of how you appear. Alabama passed a similar law. Yet Florida defined Black as being 1/8 African ancestry or having a great-grandparent who was Black. So what that means is that in 1924, a person may be considered Black in Virginia or Alabama, but then cross state lines to Florida and no longer be considered Black. We see this phenomenon also when crossing international borders. For example, in South Africa, there are only 3 races, which are white, Black, and colored. But in Brazil, there's white, Black, and 8 in-between races, and family members can be of multiple races based on their skin colors in one family unit. To quote Michael Omi and Howard Winott again, race is preeminently a socio-historical concept. Racial categories and the meaning of race are given concrete expression by the specific social relations and historical context in which they're embedded. Racial meanings have varied tremendously over time and between different societies. Let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about how, since the 1700s, scientists have also tried to answer the question of what is race by inventing biological categories of races. Carl Linnaeus, who invented the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, etc. categorization of living beings, also came up with 4 subdivisions that he called varieties, namely Americanus, Europaeus, Asiaticus, and Afar. Johann Blumenbach, who invented the term Caucasian, similarly divided people up into racial typologies: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malay. Samuel Morton was a prominent American physician, and he developed the practice of craniometry in the mid-1800s. He collected skulls and measured their dimensions and volume using birdseed. He further delineated these biological categories of people by also categorizing each group's level of intelligence and assigning physical attributes particular to each group. By collecting data and assigning measurements, Morton was making an effort to make race a scientifically objective category instead of a political one. Since the dominant belief at the time was that brain size correlated with intelligence, Morton uses data to determine that whites had supposedly the highest intellectual endowments and that Ethiopians were supposedly slow in acquiring knowledge, restless, revengeful, and fond of war, and that Native Americans were somewhere in the middle. Fast forward to the second half of the 20th century, this is the legacy that we have carried forward to current times, that is that there's this pervasive idea among scientists and politicians that there must be some biological difference between people placed in these politically created, unstable categories. For example, in 1950, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization released a statement on race that stated that race is not so much a biological phenomenon as a social myth. But due to uproar from geneticists and scientists, they were pressured into releasing a modified statement the next year, stating that it was possible for there to be some type of biological differences among racial groups. This sounds disturbingly familiar to what we just heard. So if we move forward a little bit more, people tried to definitively answer this question by looking at genetics. In the 1960s, a scientist named Richard Lewontin tried to answer this question by doing gel electrophoresis experiments to analyze genetic similarities and differences between people based on protein expression. And what he found is that 85% of all genetic variation is between two people in a local population. That was not a satisfying enough answer to the question of whether biological differences existed. So in 1990, the Human Genome Project was founded as a $3 billion initiative through the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Energy. In 1998, the Human Genome Project partnered with Celera Genomics to speed up their PCR sequencing. They analyzed the genes of 3 women and 2 men who identified as Hispanic, Asian, white, and Black. Their analysis covered 3 billion base pairs, about 20 to 25,000 genes per person. And what they found was that the human species cannot be divided into biological races. Let's dig into their results a little bit more. Human beings are 99.9% genetically identical. And to put this in perspective, 90% of our genes are shared with mice, and 98.7% of our genes are shared with chimpanzees. There is less genetic variation in the entire human race than there is in a typical wild population of chimpanzees. The 0.1% of genetic difference that is present is meaningful, but it's not organized by race. And what I mean by that is that it's not grouped into distinct units that can be identified by a person's race. Instead, what we see is something called clinal variation. This means that genetic differences are characterized by gradual changes across geographic regions or clines, and not sharp categorical distinctions, which we might understand to be races. This map organizes the amount of genetic variation by color. Yellow means the most amount of genetic variation, and red means the least. So as you can see, the 0.1% of genetic variation in the human population exists as a continuum rather than in discrete categories. This concept is known as clinal variation. There are gradations of frequencies of alleles for single nucleotide polymorphisms and microsatellites. These gradations loosely follow historical geographical migrations. The differences are a matter of frequencies of alleles, not the absence or presence of genomic types. There are no alleles that make someone Black and no alleles that make someone white. Ultimately, the clinal nature of geographical genetic difference does not match up with our common understandings of what race is. For example, Hungarians share DNA with Central Asians, but are considered white. And in fact, the greatest amount of genetic diversity exists in sub-Saharan Africa. This region contains the entire range of human variation, as demonstrated by the wide array of colors in the map. Analyzing the genetic material of 3 people from the Congo, from South Africa, and from Ethiopia would show that they're more genetically different from each other than each of them would be as compared to somebody from France. Even though we had and answer that there are no genetic differences organized by race, people still continue to try to study and elucidate some differences. And a question of a genetic basis for race continues to be asked. A study in 2002 from a group out of Stanford organized the DNA from over 1,000 individuals representing 52 global populations, specifically with the goal of trying to identify genetic groupings within the 0.1% of genetic variation within the human species. In their paper, they identified 5 main genetic clusters corresponding to major geographic regions. And these regions loosely represent commonly understood races because they're continental groupings. The paper basically tried to demonstrate that our political understandings of race do have some basis in our genetic material. But if we look more closely at their analysis, we can see it's false. They used a program called Structure, which divides the genetic sequences from sampled individuals into a predefined number of statistically significant clusters. Let's say we group people into 2 clusters. Then we essentially get Africa and the Americas. If we divide people into 3 clusters, If we divide people into 3 clusters, we actually get Africa, Americas, and the Kalesh group in northern Pakistan, who claim to be descended from Greek soldiers. If we can continue to find statistically significant genetic clusters. In fact, the program allows us to divide people into up to 20 clusters. So does this mean we have 2 races or 3 races or 20? In fact, this analysis again proves the point that there are no biological races. In the same study, it was found that the most variation existed within the clusters rather than across clusters. Again, the same as the gel electrophoresis studies from 40 years earlier, even these genetic studies show that within group variation is much bigger than between group variation. And again, they wrote that genetic differences among human populations derive mainly from gradations in allele frequencies rather than from distinctive diagnostic genotypes. Of the 4,000 alleles that were present more than once in the samples, 46.7% appeared in all major regions represented: Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, East Asia, Oceania, and America. Only 7% of these 4,000 alleles were exclusive to one region. And region-specific alleles were usually rare, with a median relative frequency of 1% in their region of occurrence. So the more we analyze the genetic variation among humans, the more that we see that the variation, which is based on frequencies, does not differentiate us into genetic groups. Often when people are faced with the evidence that there's not a genetic basis for race, but that genetic variation correlates with geographical migrations, we have a tendency to try to substitute geography for race. However, geographic boundary lines are political, not drawn by natural barriers, and do not correlate to genetic variation frequencies. And the idea of continental populations as natural groupings is grounded in the concept of populations as natural, isolated, and static, which we know is not true. What about ancestry? If we don't use race as a biological category, then can we categorize people according to ancestry instead? For example, in clinical studies, should we be collecting information about ancestry instead of about race? Still, we reach the same point. Genomic science doesn't translate to dividing people up in discrete categories because genomic science finds that there are gradations of frequencies, not absolute differences. What we see is that the statistical analysis of genomic science, which shows differences in frequencies, translates very poorly to describing the ancestry of a single individual, which would require absolute genetic distinctions between groups. So everyone wants to get their genetics typed through services like 23andMe, but are these analyses even valid? If you have a particular allele, how does that make you 37% Native American if that allele could exist in any other place in the world? Okay, so if race isn't biology, then what is it? We've seen that there are no biological races in the human species, and that biologically, race is an arbitrary category. So what that means is that race must be a political category. In the 1990s, there was a randomized controlled trial comparing the effectiveness with an IV streptokinase, an oral aspirin, and a placebo to treat 17,000 patients hospitalized for signs of myocardial infarction. When the patients were divided by astrological sign, the statistical analysis showed that patients born under Gemini or Libra suffered an adverse effect from aspirin. The authors of this study automatically disregarded this analysis as astrological sign is arbitrary. Just because there was a statistically significant difference, it doesn't mean that astrological sign is biologically relevant. Race is just as arbitrary of a biological category. You might think that from this presentation so far, what I'm saying is that because race is not biologically real, it doesn't exist. However, race exists because we experience it every day. Race is a deeply entrenched part of our lived experiences. Race is a political system that will not be brought down with scientific evidence alone. Race persists neither because it is scientifically valid, nor because its invalidity remains to be proven. Race persists because it continues to be politically useful. Those are the words of Dorothy Roberts. She also writes, "We know race is a political grouping because it has roots in slavery and colonialism. It has served a political function over the 400 years since its inception, and its boundary lines have shifted over time and across nations to suit these political purposes." So when I say that race is a political category, what do I mean? I mean that our understandings of race are constantly formed and reformed by legal, economic, cultural, educational, and medical institutions. This is the concept of racial formation. Race is not just a social construct, it's constantly being created and recreated through our laws, policies, and practices. How we fund education, who we let into the country based on our immigration laws, who goes to jail. The way that these policies create race is by differentially treating some groups rather than others. For example, some of the examples that I've listed here are the progression of slavery to Jim Crow laws to mass incarceration, early citizenship cases that determine who could become a citizen in this country, cultural representation and stereotypes, from minstrel shows to Hollywood to the music industry, the GI Bill, which allowed free college education to white veterans returning from war but not Black veterans, the Federal Housing Authority, and the practice of redlining, which is single-handedly responsible for increasing the average cumulative wealth of white families and not Black families in this country. Immigration laws spanning from the Chinese Exclusion Act to Asiatic barred zones to the Muslim ban, the model minority myth, post-9/11 Islamophobia. There are many examples that we could go over. I also want to go back to talking about Samuel Morton and craniometry. Why is it so important to understand that race does not equal biology? Essentially, he was manipulating his data to fit and reinforce the dominant racial stereotypes of the time. And his work was published in PNAS, which continues to be one of the most highly regarded scientific journals in the US. There are many other examples from this time period. In 1851, Samuel Cartwright, another prominent physician, wrote that the darkness of the Negro skin pervaded his membranes, muscles, tendons, fluids, and secretions, including his blood and bile. Under the guise of objectivity, supposedly scientific conclusions were used by folks in the South to justify the continuation of slavery in the 1840s and 1850s. For example, concluding that enslaved Black people had lower lung capacities served as scientific justification that manual labor, which supposedly invigorated the breathing and health of enslaved people. And to this day, most American PFT machines automatically include a race correction variable in their measurements. Furthermore, in the early 1900s, physicians publishing in JAMA characterized tuberculosis as a biologically distinct disease among Black people versus white people. In the 1930s, Caldwell and Malloy used pelvimetry to develop a classification of pelvises, which reduced the wide variety of anatomical variation into only 4 categories of pelvises, of which the anthropoid pelvises were supposedly typical of the, quote, lower races. Essentially, giving biological credibility to the social and cultural meanings of race allowed and continues to allow race to become an innate characteristic and gives race a permanent indelible status. And in this way, science and medicine are also race-making institutions. So, back to the quote that I had read earlier from Michael Omi and Howard Winott. There's a continuous temptation to think of race as an essence, as something fixed, concrete, and objective. And there's also an opposite temptation to see it as a mere illusion, which an ideal social order would eliminate. In our view, it is critical to break with these habits of thought. The effort must be made to understand race as an unstable and decentered complex of social meanings constantly being transformed by political struggle. Okay, we just covered a lot of ground. I'm gonna drink some water and then we'll do a quick recap of what we've learned so far. So, recap. Firstly, race is not a biological category. Secondly, race is an unstable political category with meanings that change over time and place because of political struggle. Thirdly, race is a part of our lived experiences and a part of health, disease, illness, science, and medicine, so we can't ignore it. So let's apply the concepts that we've learned so far. One of the most important discussions we have about race and racism is that of health disparities. We have abandoned the idea that there are biological differences between races. So then how do we grapple with and understand racial health inequities? If there's no prematurity gene or asthma gene, we need a new framework. Of course, you all have heard about social determinants of health. Let's take that framework one step farther and deepen our analysis. If race is an unstable, socially and politically produced category, then we can extend this argument and say that diseases and health disparities and inequities are also socially and politically produced. The key point is that the same structural conditions that create differential experiences by race, giving white people more privilege and power in this country, also create differential health conditions by race. We need to understand diseases, not just people, in their social context as politically produced by racism. Another way of saying this is that racialized bodies incur biological consequences. Ultimately, the political structures and institutions in our society and in our health and illness are intimately connected, and they're not mutually exclusive. I'm sure you all have heard about the immense differences in maternal morbidity and mortality for Black and white women. The statistics from the CDC from between 2011 and 2016 show that the rate of maternal mortality for Black women is 4 times that of white women, coming in at just above 40 deaths per 100,000 live births for Black women, compared to 12 or 13 deaths per 100,000 live births for white non-Hispanic women. We see a very similar trend in infant mortality. Between 1960 and 2011, the US infant mortality rates have actually decreased quite a bit, but there still remains this persistent gap between the mortality rates for Black and white infants. So how do we account for these disparities? We've already established that it's not genetics. So is it race or is it class? That's actually a trick question because this is a presentation about how racism produces disease. So I think you all know the answer, but I want to expand on this point a little bit. In this country, we're uncomfortable talking about race, and instead we like to talk about socioeconomic status, which is in some ways just a fancy way of saying class. We use class as a proxy for race, but racial disparities persist even when we control for class. One study examined low birth weight and the mortality rates of Black and white infants, both born to college-educated parents. So even when we control for class, racial disparities persist. We see similar trends across the board. According to the Institute of Medicine's 2002 report on equal treatment, when health outcomes were analyzed by race and controlled for income level and insurance coverage, disparities still existed. Black patients were less likely to be given appropriate medications for heart disease, less likely to undergo CABG, and experienced higher death rates due to being less likely to receive dialysis and kidney transplants. Black people were also 3.6 times as likely to have legs and feet amputated because of diabetes, and cesarean sections were 40% more likely among Black women compared to white women. The general trend is worse health outcomes and a higher burden of chronic disease. So how do we explain these health outcomes? How does structural racism translate into worse health outcomes? Over the past few years, researchers have developed several models for understanding how racism becomes embodied. The stress of experiencing racism gets translated into our bodies in several ways. Allostatic load is a quantitative way to describe hormonal pathways like cortisol and renin. Epigenetics is a framework for explaining how genes get turned on and off by DNA methylation. These patterns of DNA methylation get carried forward through inheritance. If a pregnant person is experiencing stress, this gets translated into their fetus's DNA. And for example, if the fetus has developing ovaries, then the stress can even get translated into the fetus's primordial oocytes. So a person experiencing stress can pass that stress genetically to their grandchildren. This is a form of intergenerational trauma. To drive this point home, there was a recent study examining breast cancer rates among Black women. The study showed that being born in a Jim Crow state was associated with increased odds of ER-negative breast cancer among only Black women, not white women, with the strongest effect for women born before 1965. The Black versus white odds ratio for ER-negative breast cancer was higher among women born in Jim Crow versus non-Jim Crow states. This is evidence that structural racism in the form of Jim Crow laws affected Black women by leading to higher rates of breast cancer that is harder to treat and carries higher morbidity and mortality. Another example of the effect of Jim Crow laws is the rates of low birth weight, which carries a high risk for infant mortality. For Black women who were born in the late 1960s, their infants had a much lower risk of low birth weight than the infants of Black women who were born in the early 1960s. This shows that Jim Crow laws affected not just the women giving birth during and after the Jim Crow era, but their children and grandchildren. To summarize this very succinctly in the words of the Black Mamas Matter Alliance, race is not the risk factor, racism is. So when we talk about something like COVID and racial disparities in terms of who's getting the disease and who's dying from the disease, it's really important to understand how that racism, not race, has been and continues to play out in the impacts of this disease. Okay, let's do another recap. Firstly, race is not a biological category. Secondly, it's an unstable political category with meanings that change over time and place. But racism has biological consequences. Now we can really complicate our understandings of the interplay of biology and political struggle when it comes to understanding what race means and its significance. Race may not be a biological category, but our lived experiences of race are biologically significant, down to the level of our DNA. The biological and political definitions are intimately intertwined and not mutually exclusive. So, in medical education, when we leave race unexplained, the assumption is that it's biological. What are the consequences of assuming that race is biological in medicine and medical education and clinical practice? For example, there was a study published in PNAS in 2016 that examined the beliefs of medical students and residents at UVA. This paper found that medical students often believed myths such as Blacks age more slowly than whites, or Blacks' nerve endings are less sensitive than whites, or Blacks' skin is thicker than whites. And residents believe these myths too. This is the reason why we see things like how Black patients get less pain medications in the emergency room for the same conditions as any other patient. In the case of sickle cell disease, 99.5% of Black Americans do not have sickle cell disease, but it is considered a Black disease. It is common in other areas, but we do not as automatically jump to testing people for sickle cell disease if they're South or Southeast Asian or if they're South American. To illustrate this point, most states changed their newborn screening for sickle cell disease from targeted high-risk Black infants to all children. When this happened, the number of diagnoses doubled in Connecticut. In Georgia, the universal screening diagnosed 20% more Black infants than targeted screening. Ultimately, this showed that sickle cell disease is not just a Black disease, and counteracting this narrative actually leads to more diagnoses and hopefully better care. As a side note, some of you may know that the Black Panther Party set up targeted screening programs for sickle cell disease for Black people. Though this may appear to present sickle cell disease as a Black disease, it is important to understand that the many health programs of the Black Panther Party were designed to enable access to care for Black people. If we look at the USPSTF guidelines for screening for diabetes, or the ASCVD calculator, without the analysis that we just went through, it would be very easy to assume that there's some biological reason why, as the USPSTF writes, Black, Native American, Asian American, and Latinx folks have a higher incidence of diabetes. This is an opportunity for us to underscore that racism is the risk factor for chronic diseases like diabetes, stroke, and MI, not a racial biological predisposition. Furthermore, eGFR is commonly listed with different values for Black patients. So when you get a panel 7 back, you see eGFR and then eGFR for African American or Black patients. The researchers who developed the MDRG equations in 1999 used a race correction factor in their equations because that helped the equation fit their data better. But they attributed this correction factor to supposedly increased muscle mass in Black Americans based on limited small studies that actually didn't even look at muscle mass compared between races. And medical institutions still propagate this myth, which a myth that implies that Black bodies are somehow biologically distinct compared to other bodies. We need to either stop using a race correction factor in calculating eGFR, something which impacts people's access to dialysis and kidney transplants, or develop a better equation. Additionally, the JNC8 guidelines have different recommendations for Black and non-Black patients. This again would somehow suggest that somehow Black patients are biologically distinct. However, new research is showing that ACE inhibitors don't work as well for Black patients because chronic stress due to experiencing racism activates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. And when ACE inhibitors try to counteract that pathway, it doesn't work as well. So again, racism is the reason that ACE inhibitors don't work as well, not something that has to do with race specifically or some innate biological characteristic. Due to the organizing efforts of medical students and residents across the country, many academic hospitals, including San Francisco General Hospital, University of Washington, and Vanderbilt, are actually now abandoning the dual eGFR reporting. Okay, I also want to talk about the VBAC calculator, which we use all the time in obstetrics. In this calculator, selecting Hispanic or African American subtracts from the overall likelihood score by anywhere from 10 to 25%. The Groveman study that this calculator is based on cites a large prospective observational study that found that race, marriage and insurance status, tobacco use, and BMI all affected VBAC success. This makes sense. An observational study, which is a snapshot in time, is bound to show racial disparities in health outcomes, which we have established exist due to structural racism. But it is circular logic to then include race in the calculator, which discourages Black and Latinx pregnant people from pursuing TOLAC and reinforces the already higher rate of C-section for those populations. Not only that, but among the social factors that also included marriage and insurance status that these studies cite as impacting a patient's VBAC success, only race was included, which again replicates the myth that somehow Black and brown bodies are biologically distinct. Even the way that race is included in the calculator doesn't make sense. According to the calculator, you can only be Black or of Hispanic origin, but not both. Implicitly, white, Native American, and Asian people are lumped into an other category that is not a selection button on the calculator. Not to mention that the term Hispanic is outdated and is very nebulous. And depending on your experiences growing up, you may or may not consider yourself Hispanic, and somebody else may or may not consider you Hispanic. So it's not actually a fixed category. The commentary by Vyas et al., which has been passed around the department a few times this year, digs into the VBAC calculator in more detail, and I strongly encourage everyone to read it. But to summarize it very briefly, there's no biological plausibility for lower VBAC success scores depending on race. Differences in VBAC success are inequities because they reflect the effects of structural racism. In other countries like Sweden and Canada, the data has shown that differences in VBAC success are actually not related to race. So we should stop selecting any racial identification buttons when we calculate patients' VBAC success scores, especially in clinic, when the counseling is so critical to shaping how people compare their desires and beliefs to their medical risk. Or we should find a better calculator. I want to go back to the point that I was making before. So we need to understand diseases in their social contexts as politically produced and use social and political interventions to improve health outcomes. When we use social policies and improve the social safety net, health outcomes actually get better, amazingly enough. A study from 2008 looked at the mortality gap between Black and white people between 1966 and 2002. Between 1966 and 1980, the mortality gap actually improved. And this is because of the passage of many social policies during that time, especially in the second half of the 1960s. This included the creation of Medicaid and Medicare, the War on Poverty, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What these laws and policies did is expand economic opportunities and economic resources, including access to medical care. Court-ordered school desegregation was also a part of this process. In 1980, with Reaganomics and with public services cut, the mortality gap widens again. Public health programs and anti-poverty actions and affirmative action were all decreased, and the popularity became a lot less. And we see that at the same time, the mortality gap increased again. So because race has political implications, we can use social policy to improve health outcomes. What this means is that the solution to health disparities is structural. There are many levels of action steps that we can take. I think what we need to do is we need to start by acknowledging racism as a part of our institutions, especially within medicine. Not just past history, but also our present history. At the intrapersonal level, implicit bias training is always a good thing to do and has been shown to improve representation in like medical training environments. For example, there's a paper in the Journal of Academic Medicine from a few years ago written by the admissions director for the medical school at Ohio State. What they did is they had all of the people who were doing their admissions process for their medical school do implicit bias training. And what they found was immediately the year after that training was done, their medical school admitted more students who were from underrepresented minorities in medicine. I also think it's important to do anti-racism reading and training and look at the history of medicine and how many vestiges of racist medical practices that we have that we continue to today, but that have become so sanitized that we don't even realize that they're there. At the interpersonal level, we should be teaching medical students that race is not biological. We should ask patients how they identify instead of assuming. And one of my friends also suggested a very simple question, which if you feel comfortable having this discussion with your patients, I think it could be a really good idea, which is to ask patients, how has racism affected your life? Another thing that we can do is to think critically about when race modifiers are relevant and how data about race is collected in research. At the institutional level, there are lots of things we can do. For example, Centering Pregnancy is a national program which has been shown to specifically improve pregnancy outcomes for Black and Latinx patients. Representation in medical schools, in residency programs, among academic faculty, it all matters. And we need to prioritize having diverse faculty people. There's also a program, a national program called Ban the Box, which is a movement to take away the checkbox on all employment forms that says, check here if you have a criminal record. Because what this does is for people who have been through incarceration, it limits their employment opportunities. There's also something called E-Verify, which some of you may have heard of. It's an automatic program that checks social security numbers and checks somebody's immigration status during employment. This is also a program that we could get rid of in our institutions. There's a hospital called Vidant Health in rural North Carolina. And one thing that they did is when they realized that their employees were their community and that the hospital was really closely tied into the economic health of the community, they raised the minimum wage for all of their employees. And that is one form of economic justice for rural communities. Or actually ours, I'm sure you all remember the strikes that were happening in the fall. And on the structural level, we can always be teaching people organizing skills, and we can always advocate for a social safety net and invest in Black and brown communities and learn to talk to our elected officials. Want to acknowledge that part of what made this presentation possible in this timely fashion was the Black Lives Matter movement. And many of you have probably heard calls from the Black Lives Matter movement to defund the police. What this stems from is from abolition, which means eliminating the police state. And it calls for prioritizing and investing in public resources and the social safety net, which, as we saw when we looked at that study about mortality rates, investing in the social safety net is a public health intervention. And when people talk about defunding the police, I just want to give an example from the budget for San Jose. The annual budget for the San Jose Police Department is $440 million. In comparison, the San Jose Unified School District, they faced a $23 million budget cut this year. If we even took 1% of the San Jose Police Department budget, that would cancel school lunch costs for all students for over half of the school year. So that just goes to show again that investing in our communities produces better health outcomes. So as physicians, it's our responsibility and it's our job to advocate for investing in the social safety net. We shouldn't feel like there's nothing we can do or this discussion is too political for us, because it does matter to us and it is relevant to us. Okay, so takeaways. First of all, race is a political category, and structural racism has biological consequences. Secondly, not explaining this in medical training leads to the assumption that race is primarily a biological category. And thirdly, start with the framework that race is a political phenomenon and that the solution to racial disparities is structural. I have a worksheet here that I just wanted to share with folks to look over briefly. What it is a continuum on becoming an anti-racist multicultural institution. And Dr. Mahari is going to eventually talk about how the OB-Gyn department is working on taking anti-racism steps in the department and in patient care. And I just wanted to show this to people to kind of provide a framework for how change happens within institutions beyond just what my ideas were. And I'm happy to send this out to folks afterwards as well. Here's a framework for taking action steps. One is identifying strategic goals at your home institutions. Secondly, identifying who potential allies and potential opposition are. And then thinking about under what conditions might the decision makers make change. These are my acknowledgements. As I was saying before, much of the content from this presentation is from the book Fatal Invention by Dorothy Roberts. There are also a couple of other books here to check out. One is called Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields. And then I also quoted some words from Michael Me and Howard Bonan. A lot of the art in this presentation is from the Repeal Hide Art Project, which you can, and Culture Strike and Design Action Collective, all of whom you can follow on Instagram. And thank you so much to the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center Department of OB-Gyn. I just want to end with a quote from Patricia King, 1992, The Dangers of Difference. An appropriate strategy should have as its starting point the feasible presumption that Blacks and whites are biologically the same with respect to disease and treatment. Presumptions can be overturned, of course, and the strategy should recognize the possibility that biological difference in some contexts are possible. But the presumption of equality acknowledges that historically the greatest harm has come from the willingness to impute biological differences rather than the willingness to overlook them. Thank you very much. Okay, let's have some time for questions. How do I?
So they should be able to